Hey, welcome back to Medical Assisting. So this week's lecture is on the respiratory system. It's chapter 15 in your medical assisting textbook. Make sure that you're staying on top of Google Classroom so that you are aware of assignments and expectations at all points in time. I hope you all had a wonderful winter break. I'm just trying to get my screen to cooperate with me. The first thing we're going to talk about is basically the pathway of oxygen, where we breathe in, how we produce and expel, and basically the impact on the human body. So let me get to where I need to go. Just as a heads up, in your textbook, if you're using a hard copy textbook, this is chapter 15. It starts on page 274 and it goes all the way to page, oh, I skipped it, hang on. All the way to page 295. Your vocab quiz is tomorrow, so be aware of that as well. Okay, so the pathway of oxygen is really just how we inhale and what we exhale, what body parts are involved, and where oxygen really comes from. So in the environment, oxygen is provided continuously by plants on land and in the sea. They use sun, water, and carbon dioxide to make oxygen, which they release into the air. We breathe oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. And we also exhale a little bit of water vapor. This cycle gives us basically life. It's what keeps us alive, sustains our life. Oxygen in the air is essential to the survival of living cells. An adult human being can carry, they do carry 2 quarts of oxygen in the blood, lungs, and tissues. So the way that I kind of think about this is there are 4 cups in a quart. If you take 4 cups of water and you put them all into a container, that's a lot of water. Well, then you're going to double it. So then it's 8 cups, which is 2 quarts. 8 cups of water is a lot of water. So obviously water is more visible because we can't see air, but if you just kind of use that to just determine the size variation, like how much we actually carry, it's a lot. But you know, terrible examples aside, the supply is adequate to sustain life for about 4 minutes. That supply of 2 quarts of oxygen in the blood is sustainable for 4 minutes of life. The respiratory system is responsible for taking in air and removing oxygen and sending it through the blood to the cells of the body. The oxygen concentration of inhaled air is about 21%. The respiratory system also takes from the blood the waste and produces the product of carbon dioxide. It takes it out, it exhausts it from the lungs. Exhaled air still contains about 16% oxygen. When the level of carbon dioxide in the blood rises to a certain point, the respiratory center in the brain is triggered and breath is taken. This function is vital to life, and its interruption for just a few minutes will result in death. So let's talk about the actual parts of the body that are involved in the pathway of oxygen to the internal cell. So the first parts are your mouth and your nose, because this is where we breathe oxygen in. This is the starting point. If you remember in infection control, we talked about portals of entry. Your mouth and your nose are both portals of entry and portals of exit. You inhale oxygen, but you're also inhaling microorganisms and pathogens and any bacteria maybe that you're encountering, especially with COVID that's going on nowadays. It's really important to be mindful that you are wearing a mask so that you're not inhaling things that you're not supposed to be, like COVID-19 or, you know, any other droplets or respiratory illnesses that can be inhaled. But that aside, so your mouth and your nose are your first starting points. So you inhale through your mouth and your nose, and then it goes into your pharynx, which is your throat. Pharynx is one of your key terms for this week. Your pharynx is your throat. It is the top portion of your throat where your glottis and your epiglottis, your uvula, the space in between your nose and your larynx, that is your actual pharynx in your throat. Then you have your larynx, which is your voice box. There's some really good graphics in the next slides to come that kind of show how the larynx looks and how it works. The trachea is your windpipe. And then that's where the oxygen goes down in and is exhaled carbon dioxide. Bronchi is the next part, and then you have your bronchioles, and then you have your alveoli, which are the little sacs of air sacs that sit at the end of the bronchioles. So in this picture, which this picture is really good, it shows the entire respiratory tract. So here's your nose here. Let me get my little pointer out here. Your nose is here. This is where we inhale along with your mouth. They both travel back down. See how this, there's a space right here. You inhale through your nose. It comes in through the nasal cavity into the nasopharynx. Then it goes into the oropharynx and then the laryngopharynx, which are all part of your throat. And then you have your esophagus, and then you have your trachea. The trachea is where the oxygen goes down and the carbon dioxide comes up. But you have this thing called an epiglottis right here, which is really cool because it clamps down, like it kind of acts like one of those automated trash can lids that like flaps down when you're swallowing so that food doesn't go down into your trachea. But we will talk about that in a little while. But so now you're into your larynx, which is here. And then this is your bronchi or bronchi. And then you get into your bronchioles, and then your alveoli are the little sacs of air, or air sacs here at the end. And even further there, you have your capillaries, which is actually where some of the exchange of like waste and carbon dioxide happens. So let's talk about the nose specifically. So the structure and the function of the nose are as follows. It is a cavity that is divided by a wall of cartilage called a septum. You have multiple septums in your body, but this one's the one people are most commonly familiar with because if you've ever had an appointment with an ear, nose, and throat doctor, they've probably mentioned, oh, you have a deviated septum, or, oh, you know, this is going on, or on this side of your septum, etc. But a septum is just a wall. That's what that means. The structures inside of the nose warm and filter the air. So you have cilia, which are little hairs inside of your nose that warm the air. They also help trap bacteria and pathogens and prevent them from getting into that mucosal layer inside of your nose. Then you have the conchae, which are the three bones, and they add moisture. And then you have your mucous membranes, which trap dust and bacteria and, again, help to prevent infection. That's the point of those mucous membranes. Also to keep it moist so that you can breathe in warm air. Okay, so the structure of the pharynx, which is your throat, it's the passage for food and air. It connects your mouth to the larynx, which is your voice box. The pharynx serves as a passageway, but occasionally there's a mistake. So it's not possible to swallow food and breathe at the same time. When this does occur, it results in choking, which can be really serious because I remember how I told you about that epiglottis. It kind of confuses that epiglottis, and maybe the epiglottis doesn't close down on top of the trachea while you're digesting food, or ingesting food to prevent food from getting into the airway. If food gets into your airway, it can be called aspiration, which is actually really dangerous. We don't want food or water or drinks or anything of the sort to get into the airway because that can cause an infection and then make for some pretty serious problems. Normally when food's swallowed, the epiglottis is pushed by the base of the tongue to cover the opening into the larynx. At the same time, the larynx moves up to help close the opening. When the opening to the larynx covered by the epiglottis, food is directed down the esophagus into the stomach instead of into the airway. I know we've all probably had that moment where we're like, oh, it got in the wrong pipe. It's very painful. That's because food is not meant to go into your airway, nor are liquids. It is specifically for air passage. When air passes under the epiglottis, it enters the larynx. This is a table in your textbook 15-3 that shows the vocal cords, and we're actually going to see that in another slide. So it's commonly called the voice box, your larynx is. It is a tube with a series of 9 separate cartilages maintaining its opening. It's pretty interesting if you think about how your voice box makes sound, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. Going back to the epiglottis really quick, air passes over the open epiglottis and enters the larynx. So we talked about how it prevents food from getting into the airway, but we didn't really talk about how we breathe and how the epiglottis impacts breathing, which is basically just the air passes right over the epiglottis and then enters the larynx to produce sound and to breathe. So this is the image I was telling you about with the larynx. It's also called the voice box. It's a tube made up of 9 separate cartilages. We just talked about that. It's lined with mucous membranes that form 2 folds called the vocal cords. So it's really, this image is really interesting. It almost looks kind of like a mouth. When I teach this in class, people are always like, oh, that's so cool. So here's your esophagus right here in front. Your trachea is actually kind of behind. And then you have your vocal cords, which are the cartilages to maintain openness. So you see how there's these 2 kind of like sheet bands right here that open and close and cause vibrations, which is what we do to how we maintain sound. It too is lined with a mucous membrane so that it can maintain its health, and it has its normal flora to reduce bacteria and infections. So how do we make sound? So the vocal cords move across the larynx when they're struck by air. They are tense they're held tensely by contracting muscles, and the degree of tension and the length of vocal cord determines the pitch of the voice. The tighter and longer the cords are, the higher the pitch of the voice is. This is something that I think is interesting, and when I brought this question up in class the other day, like how do we know, like how do we determine who's a good singer and a bad singer? Like how do the vocal cords, how does it all come into play? And I just thought that was a really interesting way to kind of visualize it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the trachea, which is also called the windpipe. Again, I told you, if you go back to this picture here, you can see your esophagus is in front and then your trachea is in the back, and your glottis goes over top of the esophagus, or I'm sorry, over top of the trachea, but the air goes over top of the epiglottis down into the larynx when breathing. So, but we talk, like what we need to figure out is like how do these 2 things kind of coexist? So the trachea itself is held open by rings that are like C-shaped. These rings are made of cartilage, and the wall between the rings is elastic to adjust for body positions. So this is how our esophagus can like put pressure kind of on our trachea, because it's made to bend and kind of move to accommodate. Above the middle of the sternum, the trachea divides in 2 sections, which are called the bronchi. Really quick, we can go to this picture here. You can see here's your larynx, your voice box, all that jazz. And then you have your cartilage rings of your trachea. And then this is the bronchus right here. See how it says primary bronchus? This is the bronchus here. And then these are the bronchioles. And then the alveoli are the little sacs at the end of the bronchioles. So we're going to go move back up here. So the bronchus connects to the trachea and the lungs. So it's basically like the go-between between each piece. So like your trachea is your windpipe. That's how we breathe air in. And then it goes to the bronchus, and then the bronchus becomes the bronchioles, and then the bronchioles become the alveoli, and then there's capillaries outside of that. Once you're inside the lungs, the bronchus divides and divides again to become microscopic bronchioles that act as tiny air passageways. To think that they're microscopic, I think kind of helps paint a better picture of what we're actually referring to. So the bronchus connects the trachea to the lungs, and then the bronchus becomes the bronchioles, and then the bronchioles turn into alveoli. The alveoli are air sacs. They're clusters of capillaries located at the ends of each bronchiole, and the body contains approximately 500 million alveoli, which to me is just like astounding that we have 500 million of anything in our body, because the human heart beats about 40 million times in its lifetime. So to think on a scale of millions, you have like a human heart that beats about 40 million times its entire life. And then you have 500 million alveoli inside of your lung. That's insanity to me. But it's just something I think is interesting and important to share. Let me take a drink really quick. So something that alveoli do, let me get back up here, is, well, they're necessary to sustain life. The membrane walls of the alveoli are only 1 cell thick, and they're surrounded by a network of microscopic blood vessels called capillaries. These are really like little grape clusters, kind of like if you picture it, you can see like little clusters of grapes. And this is where the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen happens in the lungs. So again, here's your picture: larynx, voice box, glottis, all that stuff's up here. Cartilage rings, trachea, primary bronchus, and then bronchioles, and then alveoli. Okay, so let's talk about external and internal respiration. So respiration, or the structure of the respiratory apparatus, has been compared with an upside down tree, with the trunk, branches, and twigs and leaves corresponding to the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. On inspiration, air enters the body, eventually ending in the alveolus. This is where I told you oxygen passes through the wall of the alveolus and into the surrounding capillaries as carbon dioxide leaves the capillaries and enters the alveolus. So kind of like it dead ends and then it has to do a U-turn, but at that time, that's where it separates and turns and goes where it needs to go. When expiration occurs, carbon dioxide exits from the bronchial tree and it is exhaled from the body. The process of getting oxygen from the nose to the alveolus and into the capillary, and then the return of CO2, which is your carbon dioxide, to the nose, is known as external respiration. So I'm going to repeat that maybe in a little bit simpler terms. The process of getting oxygen from the nose to the alveolus and into the capillaries, and then the return of carbon dioxide to the nose, is the process of external respiration. At the same time that this is happening, oxygen from the alveolus is circulating through the body to every cell. The oxygen enters the capillary surrounding the alveolus, then it circulates through a venule, and then a vein, and then back to the heart, out an artery, to an arteriole, and into a capillary next to the tissue, like the tissue cells. That's where the oxygen or the O2, you can refer to it as, in the blood is given to the cell, while carbon dioxide or CO2 from the cell is picked up by the capillary. This is the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the cell level, and it's known as internal respiration. The exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the cellular level is internal respiration. Oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveolus and the cell exchange by the process of diffusion. We had talked about diffusion and like osmosis in the beginning of our med-term journey. But just to kind of make it kind of more relevant, remember that materials move across the membrane from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. In the alveoli of the lung, O2 concentration is greater than it is in the surrounding capillaries, so it kind of diffuses into the blood. At the same time, carbon dioxide is in higher concentration in the blood than it is in the alveolus, so it leaves the blood, enters the alveolus, and is exhaled during the next respiration. And at the tissue cell, the O2 content in the capillary is greater than within the cell, so the O2 leaves the blood and enters the cell. On the other hand, though, the CO2 level within the cell is greater than it is in the capillary, so the CO2 diffuses out of the cell into the blood. And this is the process of external and internal respiration, and it's continuous throughout life. So like you're breathing in, and the whole time all of these different processes are happening, this diffusion, the exchange, everything. So also something that your lungs do is they create this fatty molecule located on the respiratory membrane. It maintains the inflated alveolus so that it does not collapse between respirations. It's called surfactant. It's kind of like detergent texture, so to speak. It's probably not the greatest example, but it's produced by the lungs to basically keep the inflation of the alveolus so it doesn't collapse between respirations and then cause the lack of oxygen and health concerns from there. So that's surfactant. So the structures of the bronchial tree are contained in an organ known as the lung. The tissue of the lung is like filled with the alveoli. It's really densely like filled with alveoli, so that it's like spongy and it's extremely light, and it would float if you placed a lung in water. Prior to birth and breathing, the lung is solid and will sink in water, but at birth, the lungs begin to fill with air, inflating the alveoli. The degree of inflation depends on the presence of how much surfactant, which is what we just talked about, the fatty molecule of respiratory membrane. Surfactant is not present in sufficient amounts to cause adequate inflation in premature infants, and sometimes also in those born with other conditions. So this is something that can cause respiratory distress syndrome, or something it's also called hyaline membrane disease. The lungs continue to mature throughout childhood with additional alveolar formation, but smoking at an early age stops the maturing of the lungs, and the additional alveoli are never developed. This is something to tell your children if they ever say they want to start smoking. That's a no. That's a no-go. Smoking is very bad. So the lung is divided into right and left. The right lung has 3 lobes, the upper, middle, and lower, and the left lung has 2, the upper and lower. The heart sits in the like kind of medial, which means middle, surface of the left lung in a space called the cardiac notch. Each lung with its blood vessels and nerves is enclosed in a membrane called the visceral pleura. The membrane also lines the thoracic cavity and is called the parietal pleura. The airtight space between the pleural membranes is known as the pleural space or cavity. It contains a lubricating fluid to prevent friction as the membranes rub together during respiration. We've talked about this before, but if you have something that's moving generates friction, and then friction generates heat, and we don't want that to happen in the pleural cavity. The space is virtually non-existent in healthy lungs because the lungs fill the thoracic cavity with the rib cage, or within the rib cage, pressing the visceral against the parietal pleura. However, something that we will discuss in the future is that some diseases can cause an abnormal presence of fluid within the pleural space. And that's where we run into some problems. Well, some of the problems that we can run into. So the diaphragm, the brain, and how it all relates to breathing. So let's talk about this. The main muscle of respiration is called the diaphragm. The action of the diaphragm and the muscles of the rib cage we talked about previously in terms of that those are smooth muscles. We talked about them in chapter 14 when we talked about the muscular system and different types of muscle tissue. But the diaphragm is principal. It's principal to the breathing process. It's the breathing muscle, so to speak. And when it contracts, it produces this vacuum that within the thoracic cavity causes air to be drawn in. When this starts, there is a negative pressure within the lungs, and then that pressure inside is less than the atmospheric pressure outside. So when the pressure inside exceeds the outside atmospheric pressure, it becomes positive and causes expiration to equalize inside and outside pressure. When the diaphragm returns to its relaxed state, air is forced out of the lungs. So if you think about it, when the diaphragm begins to kind of contract, it pushes the pleural cavity and everything up and causes the lungs to expand and inhale. And then as it relaxes, you're letting the CO2 out. You're letting the breathing process, you're exhaling. Breathing action is controlled by the respiratory center of the brain. An increase of carbon dioxide or a lack of oxygen in the blood triggers the center of the brain that controls breathing. Because we can somewhat voluntarily control our breathing, it is possible to force rapid respirations, temporarily interrupting breathing and possibly losing consciousness. We call that hyperventilating. Children will occasionally hold their breath to frighten their parents and receive like, oh my God, are you okay? You know, like that kind of like mentality. There's usually no need to be overly concerned because sooner or later, their body's gonna, that part of that brain's gonna make them take a breath and it'll be okay. It's part of the autonomic nervous system. We don't have control over the need to breathe. We can modulate how we breathe at times, but if you're starting to lose oxygen, like you're holding your breath, your body will force you to breathe at some point. Other situations can alter breathing patterns for perfectly normal reasons, like coughing. So when you take a deep breath and it's followed by a forceful exhalation from your mouth to clear something from the lower respiratory structure, coughing, that's going to interrupt your normal breathing pattern. Hiccups or singultus, which is your buzzword for this lesson. Singultus means hiccups. They're caused by a spasm of the diaphragm and a spasmodic closure of the glottis, which is like kind of odd how these two things can work together like this, but it's believed to be the result of an irritation to the diaphragm or the phrenic nerve, which innervates the diaphragm itself. Then sneezing. Sneezing is definitely something that can interrupt your breathing. Occasionally, you cough. Occasionally you sneeze. It's usually to clear something from your upper respiratory tract. And it usually results from the mucous membrane coming in contact with something that irritates it. Then there's yawning, which is a deep, prolonged breath that fills the lungs. That's definitely going to interrupt your normal breathing pattern. And then there's crying or even laughing. Like if you ever laughed or cried so hard that you kind of had to catch your breath, it definitely alters your breathing pattern. So that's something to think about. But just kind of, interesting information. So we talked about these. So for diagnostic examinations, right now we're on page 279 in the textbook. All of these are listed in here, and I encourage you to take a couple minutes to read through these. I'm going to lightly go over them because I don't want this lecture to be 45 minutes long, obviously. But arterial blood gases measure the partial pressures of both oxygen and carbon dioxide and determines the acidity of the pH, like what's going on there. Bronchoscopies, where they insert a tube into the airway to view the airways or remove a foreign body. They do this testing for a lot of different reasons. And then there's the chest CT scan, which is a computer-generated image that gives a lot of detail about the lungs and other structures inside of the chest than you can get off of just a regular chest x-ray. Most people have probably had a chest x-ray at some point in their life, so you're probably familiar with what I'm talking about. A CAT scan is a machine where they lie you flat on a table and then they run you through this little circular thing that kind of looks like a donut. And then there's an MRI, which is similar, but it's very loud. We'll talk about those another time. But you can also even get a CT scan of your pulmonary arteries, which is just accompanied by an injection of an IV contrast media to highlight those on the digital scan so that you can see what's going on in those areas. And then there's a guided needle biopsy with CT, which is where we do CAT scans, and then that helps us place needles so that we can insert a needle into a chest cavity to biopsy a lung mass. Then there's your regular chest x-ray, which is just a radiologic examination to determine general health of the lungs and surrounding tissues. We can identify if you have pneumonia through a chest x-ray because of the amount of fluid that shows on the chest x-ray. A lung perfusion scan is something that we don't do. Like, it's not something that happens a ton. It's basically the examination of a lung following an IV injection of a radioactive contrast to provide visual image of the pulmonary blood flow. So this allows us to see how the blood is flowing through the pulmonary arteries. It can be used to diagnose blood vessel obstruction, but it can be used for some other things too. Then there's the lung ventilation scan, which examines the lungs following the inhalation of a mixture of air and gases from a mask or bag that shows what areas of the lungs are being ventilated when you're breathing in and out. And then there's a PET scan, which we use to determine if somebody maybe has cancer. It's a nuclear medicine exam to determine cellular uptake in parts of the body. And there's pulmonary angiography and a pulmonary function test. These are both interesting. I encourage you to look these up on your own so you can kind of get a visual of what you're looking for here. And then there's the pulse oximeter, which is something that as medical assistants we actually use on a daily basis in the office. It's just a little device that's placed on the finger, typically the index finger. It's connected by a wire to a machine, and then it tells you the amount of oxygen in the blood and displays it digitally on the window of the machine. A sputum analysis is where somebody takes their sputum and puts it into a container, however they're instructed to do so, and then it's used in the lab for analysis. A thoracos or a thoracentesis is where we take fluid from the pleural space by needle aspiration following local anesthetic. So basically here they numb the spot, they insert a large needle into the pleural space, which is where your lungs sit, and then that's where they withdraw fluid, because that fluid can cause, if you have an excess amount of fluid in the pleural cavity, it can cause a collapsed lung. Which is very dangerous. And then here we're going to get into the diseases that are associated with this unit or with this chapter. Some of these are your key terms. Some of these are the key terms that are on your vocab quiz, so be mindful to pay attention to some of this. But just be aware that these are all here. I'm not going to go through each one because these are your key terms, but just be aware that this is the information that you need. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach me. I hope you guys have a great day.